Yo, what's going on, squad? Welcome to Return of the Athlete. Today we're diving into 5 essential core exercises. I'm excited because this is something that changed my life. As soon as I wrap my head around what core training actually was, we'll touch on some myths, and then we'll touch on what these 5 essential core exercises are for a strong and functional core. You might be thinking, Paul, I don't want a functional core. I want a toned and defined core. That happens with nutrition. You do everything that I'm talking about in this video, I guarantee you your core will blow up in a good way, not in a bad way. We don't want to get anyone injured over here. So with that said, let's dive on in. We got 5 essential core exercises, and I'm going to see if I can figure out how to flick it and click it. There we go. Core training myths. So right off the bat, I got to do thousands of crunches, Paul. I want a strong core. How many crunches do I need to do? Honestly, like 15, maybe. You don't need to do thousands of crunches, right? We've seen that person in here just boom, 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 right? The rectus abdominis is the muscles that you're training right there. And those are one of over 30 different muscles that attach to the core. So that's great. You got a strong rectus or maybe a little bit bigger muscles, but there's a lot more that needs to happen for that integrated core to work really well. Next one, smashing your low back to the floor. Raise your hand if you've heard the cue. I need you to push your low back into the floor. Lack of a better term. Hey, smash your low back in the floor, engage your core, right? Is that potentially a good cue for someone who is maybe trying to do something very specific? Maybe, potentially. But ultimately, what it ends up creating is a lot of reliance on the lower erectors, and it trains the body to find stability through rounding your back. And that's where you run into issues with your deadlifts, with your squats, is your body can no longer hold the weight that you're doing. Your core can't stabilize it. So then you end up pushing your low back on the floor. But in a squat version, you're pushing your low back out, and that's where you get some pulled muscles there. And the last one is, I kind of touched on it already, but your core is your six pack, right? Core is your six pack. Like I said, these muscles right here are the core. I'm going to stand up. Or sorry, the six pack, bam, right here. Those are one of dozens of muscles that contribute to your core. And I remember going to physical therapists. I'm in there for stress fractures. I'm in there for car accidents. And like, we got to work on your core. Your core's a little weak. And at the time I had, maybe an ab or two busting out underneath my beer belly. And I was like, what do you mean? I got a strong core. Can't you see this ab right here? And ultimately I had a weak core. So these are all things that you just got to take into account when you're doing core training. And luckily I laid it all out for you. And we'll do future videos diving into the specific exercises and demonstration, but let's touch on this one. So real quick, core definition. Your core is comprised of the muscles that stabilize and move your pelvis, lower back, hips, and trunk. So what that means is that anything that is attached to your rib cage, your spine, or your pelvis is technically a core muscle because it plays a role in how the core integrates and works together. So think about your core that way. You will be stronger for it. And here's just a quick visual as to what I mean. A lot of people think, oh, these are my core muscles, right? The abs, the obliques, the things that you can see. But what about the serratus? That plays a role. What about the lats? That plays a role. Your traps, your glutes play probably the biggest role, especially in stabilizing your pelvis. Your adductors, right? Your groin, where you're like, oh, my groin's a little tight. That's impacting your pelvis. That's impacting how your rib cage and your lumbar are able to integrate with that pelvis. That could contribute to low back pain, contribute to tight hip flexors, contribute to having a really weak drive off the tee, having zero power in a sport that you're playing. So all things to take into account and consider. But the big one is that the deeper muscles of the core, and I got another graphic that I'll show you guys in a second, but your internal obliques and your transverse abdominis, these things you can't see, but those work really cohesively, or should work cohesively, almost as like a symphony with your diaphragm, with your pelvic floor. And when that's happening, then you've got that strong core because everything works as one unit. You're able to create intra-abdominal pressure and stabilize everything in a much better way. So I'm going to rank these 5 to 1. Let's dive on into it. First one is loaded carries. So how I would think about this is walking with heavy stuff in your hands. So you could do a goblet grip carry. You could do a farmer's carry, farmer's walk. You could do that with kettlebells, dumbbells. You could do that with a trap bar. All great options. Ultimately, what you're doing is you are getting better at navigating or walking through space in your gait, right? That's how you walk with one leg in front of the other. When you do that with weight, you're going to become more functional at doing that without weight. If you ever watch someone walk and you can kind of just see like, boy, that does not look very functional, they would be a great candidate for some loaded carries. They're going to have to become more efficient in that walking in order to carry that weight and not fall over or not lose their balance. Something to take into account there. Loaded carries, I love them, but I'd say that's number 5 in terms of the list. Next, we have core flexion. This is the one you're probably all thinking about. This is when you bring essentially your knees closer to your rib cage, just like your bicep. Where's my best one for my bicep? Right here. So this is flexion of the bicep. Think of your ab right here as flexing. So if you were doing that with your core, you were essentially crunching. And you can do that in a vertical position, like my man on the rings. You can do that in a lying down position, like my man on the floor. Both work, but ultimately you're contracting the anterior core, your rectus abdominis, your abs, whatever you want to call it. And on the flip side, you have the lower back, and those muscles are going into extension, which we'll get into in a second. But you can also think about this as lateral core flexion. So you're moving left to right? You're contracting your obliques. That's something that you could do in a hip dip, something like you can do, or something that you can do in this machine right here. But both work, both are options. Now, this is the one that I was talking about, core extension, right? This is where you would flex in through your lower back and use your erectors to get a little bit stronger. And if you're doing that intentionally and with purpose, that's great. But what you don't want to do is do that unintentionally and find stability through extension because your anterior core and everything else doesn't work as a unit. So when we look at flexion, we're looking at the spine flexing in any of those. Really, it's 360 degrees of flexion that it can have, and flexion's great. But the one that I just showed previously here, this is the most common one. This is the one that you see the most. And so think about it as lateral and core extension as well. In order for there to be flexion, there has to be extension. Next, we have anti-movement. Anti-movement, Paul, what does that mean? I like to think of that as anytime I need to resist rotation or resist flexion or resist extension. In a Palloff press, like my gal's doing here, she has to resist rotation as she pushes that band out. Her right oblique, her right side of her core has to resist the band pulling her to the left. If it doesn't, the band pulls her to the left. So she is resisting movement, that anti-movement right there. Then we got my guy, he looks like a Ben, so we'll call him Ben, doing his dead bugs. The low back wants to arch more. The ribs want to flare unless you resist the movement, which is what should happen in a dead bug. So that is anti-movement. A couple other good examples. Suitcase carry. The right side of this guy's oblique, he's got the blue kettlebell, the red shorts. This right oblique has to work extra overtime to compensate for probably a 50 or 60 pound kettlebell. Same thing over here. Single arm rows, offset squats, another really great example. Offset deadlifts. Those are great for training the opposite side oblique to work. If this guy's left side oblique is not bracing and his entire core is not working as one unit, this 60-pound dumbbell is going to spin him for a loop. He's going to fall over to the right, and he's not going to be able to maintain this position. So anytime you're doing a single arm press, a single arm row, that's your core working. And when I get to a little bit later in this video, exhale on the execution, I'll talk about how you should think about breathing while you're doing things like a single arm row. So anti-movement. Next, we have bracing. This is another one that's super common. When we look at bracing, planks are probably the most common one that you'll see, right? 60-second plank, get down on the ground, could be a side plank. I would say that's probably more resisting rotation, but bracing, just like a hollow hold is another good example. You're trying to create tension, but nothing's moving. It's like an isometric that you're doing in this. And I have this image of this dude doing squats, this beast, 405 pounds on there. I'm not doing that. Most people watching this video aren't. But in order to squat heavy, your core needs to be braced. If you are inhaling and just breathing randomly with that amount of weight on your core or on your spine, you're going to run into issues. And so you need to breathe, you need to brace, you need to either use a Valsalva maneuver or what I call the leaky tire. If you haven't watched my video, the 3-part series on the low back, I cover that, I believe, in video 3. So check that out in video 3. But this is where you'll hear people say, you don't need to train your core if you're lifting heavy, because you really are working your core in these big, heavy compound lifts. I do think you should use your core more beyond just saying, oh, I deadlift and squat, I'm good, I don't need to do core. But nothing will blow your core up like lifting heavy and picking up heavy things, whether that's a trap bar and walking around with, a bunch of weight on there, doing loaded carries. That stuff builds your core more than any crunches ever can or ever will. To that point, functional breathing. This is probably the thing that I think is most foundational, most transformational, most overlooked. And the reason is because you can't see it. Can't see your diaphragm, can't see your pelvic floor, can't see your internal oblique, you can't see your internal or transverse abdominis. But those all work together to help create this pressure in this container necessary for a ribcage pelvic alignment. If you haven't watched, again, videos on the ribcage pelvic alignment, part 3 series on low back pain, this is where I dive into this a little bit more. But this is where functional breathing has transformed my life. I was working with a client this morning. It clicked for him. And if you can breathe properly and train everything to work together as one cohesive unit, as a symphony, this is going to help you maintain a lot more integrity through your core. You'll be a lot more athletic because your core is going to be able to transfer whatever energy you're moving through. If you're jumping, if you're driving a golf ball, if you are swinging a baseball bat, and you don't have this pelvic or rib cage pelvic alignment, and instead you have an open container, where you're going to leak a lot of energy in that system. So it's really important to make sure that you learn how to breathe properly, because that is the foundation for your core being able to work. When I talked earlier about all the different muscles that are attached to the different parts of the body, if those aren't at the right muscle length tensions, if one's shorter or tighter, it wouldn't be shorter, it'd be tighter. If one isn't as strong, if something's overcompensating, that can very easily, let me get my face in here because I'm talking to you guys, that can very easily lead to problems with that rib cage pelvic alignment. So if you've got a really tight lat and you just have, a ton of issues in your upper back, it's getting your body and your rib cage and pelvis to be in a neutral position that enables everything else that's connected to it to start to rest and start to relax. Super important, super overlooked, and I wouldn't sleep on it. But let's finish this up. So we got core programming, or programming the core. I like to think of loaded carries, flexion, as something to do 2 times a week. If you're doing loaded carries and you're doing deadlifts, and you're doing some really kind of heavy trap bar variation, or RDL is another good one, you're going to, get a good amount of that. But keep in mind too, we also want to walk in that exercise. So loaded carries 50 to 100 steps, however much weight you have. 50 steps might be totally adequate. If you have a 100-pound kettlebell, you might need to walk a little bit further if you've got lighter weight. Flexion could be side plank, side twists, crunches, whatever it is you're doing. 15 to 25, you don't need to go rip off 50. Just get a heavier kettlebell or a heavier med ball as you're doing that, and you'll find that you can save yourself a lot of time as you're doing that. I'll get to this in a second, but flexion is a good example of an exercise I like to do on upper body days, as opposed to some of these you really do hit more on lower body. And I'll get to that in a second, but just wanted to call that out. Anti-movement. So as I mentioned, we have single arm rows, single arm presses, you've got suitcase carries. There's a lot of things that can be anti-movement. So take that into account as you're thinking about this throughout the week. But you could totally have something like a dead bug, Palloff press, cable core twist, something like that you're doing in addition to a dumbbell single arm row. I think that's totally fine, but I try and keep those in a smaller container, because again, you could do 30 reps and take 20 minutes for one exercise, or you could just do it heavier and do 6 to 15. Bracing, again, I think squats and deadlifts are going to hit that pretty good, but if you are going to do any kind of plank or create any kind of isometric tension, 30 to 60 seconds, again, loaded up. A 5-minute plank, while impressive, is honestly a waste of time, because you could have just done it heavier, done it harder, and knocked out 5 sets of it for 1 minute. Functional breathing, I would say you should do it every single time you lift, every single time you honestly execute an exercise, because when you move into force, when you move into load, when you move into the stress and the strain of whatever it is you're doing, whether you're pressing, you're rowing, you're squatting, you want to exhale to brace. You don't want to inhale to brace, and inhale will release all the tension. So make sure you're breathing properly. And then if you do need to work on functional breathing and it's more of a PT thing, but do it daily, 3 rounds, 5 reps. I've got some functional breathing videos that I'll put down in the description that you can check out as well a little bit later. If I was going to lay this out in the week, here's how I would do it. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. We're just doing like a 4-day split, for example, here. And the way I would think about it is I'm already doing a lot on my lower body days. So bracing, functional breathing, anti-movement, those are really going to happen no matter what. On my upper body days, I might add in some flexion, some anti-movement. I would probably just do more specific core work, like more isolation exercises on Monday and on Thursday than I would on Tuesday and on Friday, because honestly, that should already be happening if you're lifting properly, you're lifting heavy enough. That's it. I think that's all we got for this. So thank you for watching. If you got any comments, questions, drop them down below. And I really try and put a lot of work into these. And I don't want to ask for subscribers, but if you want to learn more, be sure and subscribe, because I think what we're going to continue to do is these every single Tuesday, and we'll continue to do lives, I just dropped 5 certified mindset tips from Yoda and Qui-Gon Jinn. So really just trying to get creative with the content and continue to deliver value to you. And with that, I'm going to sign out, and I'll catch you guys next week, and probably future videos as well, because I love creating here and love spending time with y'all. But I'll catch you guys on the next Return of the Athlete video. My name is Paul Klingen, and I'll see you later. Peace.